Hi, welcome. Diane Costo here with the You Don't Have to Be a Neuro Guru presentation for IECA Fall 2020. I would like to go through the outline here. I'm going to go through who am I and why I'm doing this presentation. We're going to talk about the trauma and the tech effects on the brain and the what, why, and how of neurofeedback and why you don't have to be a neuro guru now to have access to or to provide neurofeedback. So who am I? This starts as I am a mom on a mission. My son was impulsive off the charts. From kindergarten through 8th grade, I struggled in finding an environment that would work for him. I didn't know about ed consultants back then, unfortunately. So I went through private school, homeschool, boarding school, homeschool, military academy. I was a single mom. I was judged for failing as a parent, I felt. I was hard on myself. I picked up every different parenting book out there that I can imagine. I didn't really believe in ADHD, so I didn't have a formal diagnosis, but I imagine he would have been pegged with that had we went that route. He was so extreme that at times we thought maybe he had Tourette's, and he was temporarily medicated for that. But I was trying everything I could think of to find an environment that he would succeed in. And I would get the same call. We really love him. He's a genius, but he's not following the program. You need to come and get him. So literally, I had to keep picking him up and removing him from various environments, trying to find a solution. Long story short, when he went to the military academy, 12 years old, that summer program, I was like, you've really got to make this work for you, bud, because the violence in the house between the two brothers, there was an older brother who was a button pusher and the younger one who had no impulse control. And so we had violence, holes in the wall. You know, I felt like it was a very toxic environment. And again, that I was failing as a mom. So when he went to that military academy, I was like, you've really got to make this work for you, buddy, or you're not welcome back home. That's how extreme it had gotten. He was refusing to do schoolwork. He was addicted to video games. You know, we were stressed and under a lot of trauma in hindsight, now that I look at it. So I get the call from the military academy and they said, you need to come and get him. And I said, no. And I did one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life. And I had him transported from South Carolina to a private boarding school for troubled teens. I tried to avoid that for all of the years. And there he went. They were willing to take him, even though he's 12 going on 13. He was a little younger than the age back then. It was harder to find programs for younger kids. I knew I needed help for him before he got to be a troubled teen, but I kept failing because I didn't have the advice and consultation to get him in an appropriate place. And there was something physically going on in his brain, I learned now. So he goes to this therapeutic boarding school in the middle of nowhere, Utah. And I get the same call a few months into it. You know, really love him. He's a genius, but he's not following the program. And I'm literally pulling my hair out. Like, you've got to be kidding me. You're the professionals. You have this school to help this type of student. What's going on? And fortunately, I was introduced to the founder of a neurofeedback company in Hilton Head Island, South Carolina. It was a small community, so people had heard about my quest to help my son. And they introduced me to him, and he said, that's the kind of kid we can help. He was a chiropractor and a professor, and he was trying to make it easier to provide neurofeedback. So I went through 3-day training. He entrusted me with the care of a $22,000 system. I put it in my car, and I drove from South Carolina over to Utah to that program. Thank goodness they had space, and they understood everything that I had been through. They welcomed me, and I set up the system in the program and began running sessions on my son. 2 weeks into the program, I explained to the parents what I was doing. Neurofeedback, it's non-invasive. I explained what I had learned about it. They were like, bring it on. We are paying more money than we have. We don't like the medications our kids have been on. We've tried everything else. Let's do this. It can't hurt. And so I was running sessions from 9 a.m. until 9 a.m. at night for Monday through Saturday and a half a day on Sunday. So I came out of the gates with this extreme experience in a controlled environment. And 100% of the people that I ran sessions on improved in some positive way. I had staff and many students. So some of them were sleeping better. Some of them were able to reduce medications. They started to brighten up and lighten up. My son actually started to develop a pause before reacting that he never had before. And therefore, he was able to start to actually participate in the other elements of the program. where before he wasn't. And so this was eye-opening and life-changing. After 40 sessions, his impulsivity was gone. And I was set out on a trajectory of continuing to be a mom on a mission, but to help other doctors, technicians, to provide this service and to get this into the therapeutic programs, which we're reaching a lot of the NATSAP programs right now. And my goal is to also get into the specialty boarding schools where we know that we have a controlled environment of students that can benefit from this. And you'll learn in a moment how the technology is shrinking so much that we can also bring it to homes, the homes of the families, where I wish I would have had it back then. So we went on this nasty roller coaster ride for many years. And here he was when he got out of the program, finally, when he was 13, after all of those years. And my oldest son took that ride. He always takes the flack because he's a rocker, literally, he's a rock star. And people always think he's the one that gave me trouble. So I have to give him some credit here for going through that ride with us. He locked into something that he was highly interested in when he was 12 going on 13. Otherwise, he would have been probably pegged with ADHD as well. But when he lit up with that electric guitar, he was fine. So enough about us and me. And that's why I'm still on this mission to provide this for people, because we went through so much for all of those years. And this needs to be more prevalent now. So let's look at the different aspects of approaching and handling the impacts of stress on the brain and on behaviors. There's the psychological, the social, the spiritual, and biological. Neurofeedback addresses the biological part, the physical part. A lot of these programs have the other elements in place. And the most, successful mental health providers are going to incorporate a variety of modalities to achieve their goal, not just one or the other, but the combination. So we have now neuroscience, we have evidence-based practices, therapeutic alliances, and psychological theories. All of this comes together, puts the puzzle pieces together, and becomes a stronger approach to helping families and children. And so what happens with the brain and you guys have probably all seen this basic hierarchy of needs. When the bottom ones are not met, whether they're physical or safety needs, love and belonging, along the way, different stressors can actually change the brain and affect the brain if these needs are not being met. So it actually affects the physical structures of the brain. Trauma impacts all these different areas of the brain, and we're not going to get into a lot of the details of this. You've seen these different parts of the brain, I'm sure. And here's a picture of them. But physically, the brain is affected. You may have even seen the pictures of a neglected brain, an extreme case, in a child or a baby, how that brain is physically smaller. Well, even not as severe as that, different areas of the brain are physically changed. As a baby is crawling and developing, different areas of the brain are growing. And so when there's neglect, those areas are much smaller. So keep in mind also that PTSD, trauma, and stress can often look like ADHD and behavior problems. This was the case somewhat with my son. He was always pretty extreme, but we had also been dragged through the family courts and had some other trauma with regards to their biological father. So I'm sure we had some PTSD that wasn't being addressed. And so these things can manifest as sleep disorders, attention problems, hypervigilance, learning disabilities. Keep that in mind as you're consulting with families as well. Memory problems, immune to certain cues, emotional numbing, and attachment difficulties. And these are all physical things that are hand in hand. Now, we actually, over the years, have been able to measure brainwave activity. Let's see if this video will actually play for you. And you may have seen this video before, but the brain is full of a lot of different pathways in there. As we're talking, communicating, learning different things, there are neurons firing literally in the brain. It's chemical reactions in the brain. You've heard of neural pathways probably. So these are the different brain signals that are happening on an ongoing basis as people are going through everyday life. Science now, we're able to measure these brainwave activities, and we know what healthy patterns are in the brain and what happens when healthy patterns are off. This can be shown in a QEEG map report. So over the last decade or so, we've measured that brainwave activity, and we understand there are certain healthy patterns. We should be able to shift between different speeds of brainwave activity, from the slow wave activity into the fast wave activity. But if we get stuck in one certain area too long, it can create challenges and symptoms. So if you're stuck on the faster processing side, you tend to see compulsivity, anxiety, OCD, panic attacks, things like that may happen. If you're kind of stuck in the idle mode, mood regulation issues happen, maybe withdrawing or being easily angered. And if you tend to get stuck on that slow end, you'll see impulsivity, ADD, and even some TBI and learning disabilities tend to be with that slower processing that gets stuck. Here's another way of looking at that list: brain too fast, or patterns with the fast wave activity that are off: anxiety, OCD, mania, worry. Excess idling, that's the mid-range, where depression, lethargy, fibromyalgia, things like that. And then into the slower things, the ADHD, learning disorders, things like that. We can see these stress cycles too. When somebody is in long-term stress or they have had trauma early on, it does change the brainwave patterns as we talked about it. And so we can see the stages as stress takes its effect on the brainwave patterns. So let's talk about neurofeedback's effect on the trauma and technology impacted brains, and why and how this is something that you need to know about to help your families. Neurofeedback is a method of training brainwaves to alter the structure and the function of the brain. And that seems pretty extreme. The structure and the function of the brain, how can you alter that? But it's true, it happens all the time, and it's called neuroplasticity. So changes associated with learning occur mostly at those levels of the synapses where you saw the firing in that video. New synapses can form, and the internal structure of the other existing synapses can change. This happens in the beginning of life when the immature brain is organizing itself and a baby's crawling, different areas of the brain are developing. Anytime we have a brain injury, and throughout adulthood, anytime we're learning something, new pathways are being created in the brain. Think about when you learn to ride a bike, or write with a pencil, or play a musical instrument. You practice, practice, practice. Pretty soon there's a new pathway in there and you don't have to think about it that much. That's neuroplasticity, and neurofeedback uses those principles. Neurofeedback's also known as EEG biofeedback. It's basically biofeedback for the brain. People ask the difference. What's the difference between biofeedback and neurofeedback? It is biofeedback for the brain. We're measuring the brainwave activity and giving the brain information on what it's doing. It's a simple learning modality using technology. It's painless, drugless, and non-invasive, and safe for all ages. Disclaimer here, that is the neurofeedback that I use, QEEG-based neurofeedback that I've used for going on 11 years now. There's no current that goes through the brain. There are different types of neurofeedback out there though. Some of them do require more of a clinical eye on it, as they may put a current, low level energy through the brain. So all neurofeedback out there, it's comparing apples to oranges. You need to investigate what style of neurofeedback and what approach. That being said, across the board, I see great results. I'm just more comfortable with the non-invasive, painless version that's a learning modality. It's gentle, and we haven't had side effects. So neurofeedback is based on over 50 years of clinical research proving its efficacy. These different conditions have great studies out there, and it's really based on that principle that we kind of know what normal brainwave activity is. And when that becomes disrupted, different symptoms occur. And it seems pretty crazy. So how come, one modality positively affects so many different conditions like autism, OCD, panic attacks, learning disorders, ADHD, anxiety? That's the biggest thing I've seen over these last 3 years. Even prior to COVID, we've seen anxiety patterns in the brain maps. And think about, what is the common factor? It's the brain. And most of these conditions are just being managed by medication, but we usually can still see the underlying patterns that are contributing to the problems that people are having. So the common factor is the brain. So the brain, once it's dysregulated, there's only so many things that can happen, and those labels are often associated with that. Another great thing about neurofeedback is that when you help the brain better regulate, it most often makes other therapies and approaches more effective. So my son, for instance, when we started to regulate that impulsivity and make that connection, that circuit that was off for all of those years, he was then able to apply all that he had learned through all of the past and all those experiences that he had. He was able to integrate them and apply them to his life, and has become an amazing person. So let's look at the why and the how of neurofeedback. I'd like to touch on how neurofeedback was founded so you understand why it can help so many different conditions and so many different people. So Barry Sturman was a sleep researcher in the 60s. He was doing this study and he was using cats and observing their brainwave activity as they were going to sleep and doing different activities. He accidentally discovered a new brainwave back then. It was called sensory SMR. And these cats were producing it when they were still alert and focused, just about like ready to pounce on a mouse type of state. And so that was pretty cool that they found this new brainwave. And they were able to actually teach the cats to produce more and more of this brainwave at will by rewarding them with a little bit of milk and broth each time they produced a half-second burst of that new brainwave. And they kept doing that, and those cats were learning to produce more and more of that still alert, focused brainwave at will. And that was amazing. So then they replicated it. Can other animals produce certain brainwaves at will? And they were able to do that with rhesus monkeys. It wasn't until Barry Sturman was commissioned by NASA to find out why the astronauts were developing seizures when they were exposed to hydrazine rocket fuel that we learned the practical implications of this. So in came the cats, and unfortunately they didn't receive the milk and broth. They were exposed to a toxin, but 10 out of the 40 cats did not develop seizures. And they realized, it didn't take them too long to realize, those were the 10 cats that were from that prior experiment. Those 10 cats that learned to produce more of that still alert, focused brainwave activity, their brains were altered to the structure and the function enough to be resistant to seizures. So when they learned to increase that brainwave, it changed their brains enough that they did not develop the seizures. That was huge. Of course, they replicated it in other animal studies, and then they moved on to try it with epileptics. If they could teach people to produce more of that brainwave activity, would they be resistant to seizures? And yes, they were. They actually published it. It was published in '78 in the Journal of Epilepsia. But if you can see this little timeline of different things that they started to use neurofeedback on, and there were specific applications that rolled out. And since then, there are tons of things. If you research neurofeedback for such and such, neurofeedback for such and such, you're going to find some really good case studies and university-based research to back it up. No, we're not supported by big pharma yet, so you're not going to see the hundreds of thousands of cases in these research things, but there are plenty out there and a lot of good results. In fact, Frank Duffy, who's a professor and pediatric neurologist at Harvard Medical School, says neurofeedback should play a major therapeutic role in many difficult areas. In my opinion, if any medication had demonstrated such a wide spectrum of efficacy, it would be universally accepted and widely used. Good point. The American Academy of Pediatrics did declare biofeedback #1 best level support for attention and hyperactivity disorders a while ago. And again, neurofeedback is biofeedback. The pediatricians didn't all see that memo though. They are used to doing what they're doing. So ask them about it. Neurofeedback is based on the principle that there is a normal pattern of brainwave activity and the brain regulates itself based upon that pattern. Keep that in mind. And research demonstrates when that pattern gets disrupted, different symptoms can occur. How does that become disrupted? We talked about it earlier. If the basic needs are not being met in the developmental cycle, or there's a long-term stressor or something, that can disrupt the brainwave. Also, just genetics, drugs, prescriptions, toxins actually change brainwave activity over time. And sometimes it's things that we're not even sure we're exposed to, or poor nutrition, for instance, where our food just doesn't have the minerals and vitamins in it that it used to. Sometimes you have a child can have a deficiency and we don't know until later in life when they have a real physical problem. Changes in the spine alignment, any kind of trauma and stress can actually change the brainwave activity. So the big deal now, why do you not have to be a neuroguru? Why isn't this mainstream yet? Again, they're not necessarily supported by big pharma yet. It's a lot of individual providers. Once it moved out of the university, there are certain people out there like me that found this by accident. And a lot of us are driven by family members that we've helped. Once it did move into some clinics, it was still experimental, hit and miss, trial and error with no structured system or approach. People would try this piece of equipment, maybe pick up this book, go to this talk, try this protocol. It was a lot of trial and error early on, and it was really hard to find the training. a book here and there, a class, just learning and talking about it. And the software was made by engineers, not clinicians. So it was very not user-friendly. It's kind of complicated. Still, some of the software out there is pretty intimidating. And it was very expensive and time-consuming early on. But you know what? That is not the case anymore. You do not have to be a neuro guru. The wave is coming. Things are changing. Technology has shrunken. You can download an app on your laptop and do training at home now safely and effectively. So today's reality is there are online courses. You can take some at our academy at SYMMETRYNeuroPT.com. We have virtual training, which we were doing even prior to COVID, but it's great with COVID too. I've certainly got programs up and running and people and families training in their homes throughout this, and people are much more receptive to that now as well. The software has been simplified and automated, so it's made for the majority now, not the minority. You don't have to take 5 years and a fortune to figure this out anymore. Things are streamlined and more sophisticated with the hardware, the amps, the sensors, and the software. It's cloud-based brain mapping database for instant analysis and reporting. You don't have to wait and send the data off now for a month and pay a lot to have somebody else interpret it. We get the results of the brain mappings within a couple minutes. We have the support that's made very easy with virtual open office meetings and easy access to the technology. And there's a lot of affordable and quick options, efficient options for people at home. So how does neurofeedback actually work? Again, we're going to start by measuring that brainwave activity, and that's going to give us a detailed report on what is going on in that individual's brain. You can see very clearly what they self-report side by side with what the EEG is saying is happening in each of those networks most responsible for those symptoms. We're not diagnosing any conditions with these QEEG brain maps. They're used to determine effective neurofeedback protocols to guide the therapeutic process as well with our intake assessments. And we're using this information to know what that brain needs to learn. What do we need to teach that brain to better regulate? Because that is the whole goal of all neurofeedback, is to teach the brain how to better regulate itself. How does it work? Number one, sensors are placed on the scalp and ears to read the brainwave activity during the sessions. Brainwaves are displayed on the computer and the software is analyzing it. When the brainwave activity meets a healthy pattern, whatever they're watching on the screen is going to play brighter and louder. They can stream anything online now with our software, Netflix, YouTube, Hulu, anything. And our software will put an overlay over top of it. It will reward the brain through operant conditioning by playing a little brighter and louder when they meet a healthy, proper goal, and it goes dimmer and quieter when they're not meeting a proper, healthy goal. Hopefully on the Q&A, we may be able to demo that for you. So basically, the software and the brain are communicating back and forth and teaching the brain to produce a healthier pattern. Over time, that's going to help better regulate the brain. Typically takes 40 to 50 sessions to get some long-term permanent results. We know the science says at least 20 creates permanent change. I don't like to do less than 30, approximately 45 minutes long. We start shorter and build up that time. And people typically begin to see some really solid results within 15 sessions, sometimes less than that. So takeaways on what you can talk to your clients and parents of clients about. This is non-invasive learning modality using technology. It's backed by decades of research proving the efficacy. The goal of all neurofeedback is to help the brain better regulate for long-term changes, and don't have to be a neuroguru anymore. Families can do this at home. So thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to all of the Q&A. We're going to bring in some other people that are using our technology in the therapeutic programs now. I've added some research references here that really go through the basics and the importance. And we'll just put those up there for you. And don't forget to fill out your evaluation for this session. Enjoy the rest of the conference. And we'll talk to you at the Q&A.